Thank you. Is the sound good? Can you hear me at the back? I would like to thank, since it's the last Berggruen Forum of the semester, I'd like to thank the Little Alf people for providing the tea and coffee, Craig Arno and the vodcast team who put the vodcasts of the Berggruen Forums up on the web, and you can access them if you go to R. Alfred and down on the left-hand side at the bottom, click on videos, you'll get the Berggruen Forum podcasts. And today, in honour of the topic, the tea and coffee is free. As some of you know, as Bill just mentioned, I'm writing a book about the idea of frugality, or simple living. And what I want to do today is share with you some of my thinking on this topic, hoping you'll have lots of interesting suggestions and questions and constructive criticisms to help me improve the final product. How did I come to be writing a philosophical study of frugality? Well, my immediate family members and other admirers will tell you that it's a natural topic for someone like me, since I'm fundamentally cheap and nasty. Aspiring writers are always told, write what you know, and here's one thing I can claim to know something about: not spending money. And I suppose I should here acknowledge the invaluable help that Alfred University has given me over many years in helping me to learn to live on a very tight budget. But to be fair to Alfred, I should acknowledge that last semester I enjoyed a sabbatical, which enabled me to do a lot of the spade work necessary for the book, and also the university sponsored me to receive an NEH summer stipend to work on the project. The idea of the book grew out of an honours course I've taught several times, Tightwaddery, The Good Life on $1 a Day. Despite the jokey title, though, the course includes a fair amount of serious philosophy, social science and culture criticism. And at bottom, the course is not about cutting coupons, but about reflecting on what really matters in our lives. And that is just another way of asking one of the oldest of all philosophical questions, the guiding question of Plato's Republic: how should one live? Here's a question. What do all these people have in common? Well, they're dead, they're mostly white, they're male, they're from the Northern Hemisphere, but more pertinent to my purposes, they've all advocated frugality or simple living. And for this reason, I'm going to call them the Frugal Sages and dub their consensus the Philosophy of Frugality. This consensus is in itself rather surprising, because it's not obvious that the best kind of life is the simple life. Some value judgments are obvious. Kindness is better than cruelty. Love is better than hate. Chocolate tastes better than cow manure. Even philosophers agree about these claims. But in general, philosophers are not known for agreeing among themselves, yet there is a remarkable consensus among the sages down through the ages that the pursuit of riches is misguided, that a person needs very little to be happy, and that the good life is the simple life. Can so many wise heads be wrong about this? Well, we can say this much: they've not been especially persuasive. Millions live beyond their means and can relate very easily to Travie McCoy when he sings that he wants to be a billionaire. So this is something worth investigating: the discrepancy between the philosophers and the people on the desirability of frugal simplicity. My guiding questions are these. And I'll start, we're talking about number one there. Often when I start thinking about a topic, I like to consult lots of dictionaries, thesauri, etymological guides and so on. This is my idea of empirical research. Seriously though, I recommend it. I find it often helps to give me a general orientation and sometimes sparks ideas. So let's take a look at some of the synonyms for terms like frugal, thrifty and simple. They form an interesting family cluster, and the discerning viewer will notice that the words have been cunningly arranged on a normative spectrum. That is a spectrum of implicit value judgments, from mean and miserly, which is bad, to natural and wholesome, which is good. On the whole, thriftiness, frugality and simple living do get a good press and have positive connotations. When you hear that someone has simple taste and lives frugally, this is usually understood as a form of praise, especially if the person could do otherwise. In this week's New Yorker, there's a profile of Warren Buffett that approvingly mentions that he still lives in the house that he bought in 1958. But even when viewed in a positive light, the concept of simple living carries several meanings. Simplicity, it turns out, is quite complex. So let's identify at least some of its senses. Here are some of the senses of simple living that you can find within the tradition of frugal wisdom that I'm taking as my starting point. It's not easy to separate these out completely. They tend to be thoroughly intertwined, but let me try to elucidate a few of them. The most familiar and uncomplicated notion pertaining to frugality is that of being fiscally prudent, of living within one's means. It's expressed in many familiar sayings: waste not, want not, a penny saved is a penny earned, and so on. One sage particularly associated with this idea of fiscal prudence is Benjamin Franklin, who loved to coin adages on this topic. A fat kitchen makes a lean will, who dainties love shall beggars prove. Franklin is especially concerned to warn against the dangers of debt, which were generally worse in his time than today. That is, it was, you suffered more if you were in debt. One of his best-known sayings is, he that goes a-borrowing goes a-sorrowing. It would be fun to resurrect him to hear his views on credit cards and student loans. Franklin is hardly alone, of course, in counselling economic prudence. Victorian novels are full of characters, typically the eldest sons of cash-strapped gentry, who live beyond their means, rack up debts, and suffer the consequences. But this is perhaps the least interesting notion of frugality, not because Benjamin Franklin's advice is not sound. It is. I advise you all to beware the little expenses. A small leak will sink a great ship. But it's awfully familiar advice, and it seems pretty obvious. Living thriftily clearly makes sense for most of us 99%ers. Really, the interesting question regarding Franklin's prudent advice isn't whether it's good, but why it has to be given so repeatedly, given its obvious soundness. One reason, of course, is that in the past, and still today, many people were desperately poor and could only survive by living beyond their means. Another reason that applies more today than in Franklin's time is that as participants in a consumer society, we're continually urged on all sides to raise our status and find our happiness through spending money. At the same time, we're offered the credit that will allow us to start our spending right now. After all, who wants to put happiness on hold? The result, of course, is mountains of debt, over-the-head mortgages, maxed-out credit cards, and so on. As the newspaper columnist Earl Wilson said, today there are three kinds of people: the haves, the have-nots, and the have-not paid for what they haves. So the concept of fiscal prudence is pretty straightforward, and the reasons for practicing it pretty obvious. More interesting, I think, are some of the other notions attached to the idea of living simply. Living cheaply essentially means living in a way that requires little money and uses few resources. Some of us think we're pretty good at this, and can tell tales of how, when we were in graduate school, we lived in a shoebox and survived on oatmeal and the smell of an oily rag. But before we get too smug, we should compare ourselves with Diogenes of Sinope. If you take Diogenes as your benchmark, you're going to feel pretty decadent. He was a contemporary of Plato's, and in fact used to go along to Plato's lectures and heckle. I wouldn't call him the granddaddy of frugal sages, that would be Socrates. But Diogenes took Socrates' philosophy and ran with it. In fact, Plato described him as Socrates gone mad. Whereas Socrates went without shoes, Diogenes didn't think he needed a house. He's living, as you can see, in a barrel. He lived in some sort of barrel and kept all his possessions in a bag. Like Socrates, he held that a person's moral character mattered above everything else. He constantly challenged conventional opinions and was utterly indifferent to what others thought of him. He used to roll in the hot sand in summer and embrace snow-covered statues in winter to toughen himself so he could put up with any hardship. And he used to toughen himself mentally. He once asked the city of Athens to erect a statue in his honour, a very unlikely event since he was widely regarded as an eccentric bum. When asked why he requested this honour, he said, "I want to practice getting used to disappointment." You've got to admire that. In fact, you could try it yourself. Faculty who are looking to practice disappointment could try asking for a Christmas bonus. Students could try asking Gary Ostrauer to raise their grade. Anyway, the story goes that one day Diogenes saw a child drinking water with his hands and promptly threw away his cup, one of his few possessions, remarking, "That child has beaten me in simplicity." On another occasion, he saw a boy scooping up lentils with a piece of bread, whereupon he threw away his spoon, disgusted with his own rampant materialism. So next time you think you're making do with little, remember Diogenes and find something to throw away. Maybe that cappuccino maker sitting unused at the back of the kitchen cabinet, or that gadget for deep-hitting olives. Of course, anyone living like Diogenes today would be considered mentally ill, and to be fair, even in his time, Diogenes was viewed as pretty eccentric. But comparing ourselves to him can be useful. For one thing, it brings out the relativity of terms like cheap, basic, or necessary. Even a normal ancient Athenian required few of the things that we consider absolutely basic necessities: electricity, running water, a flush toilet, an equipped kitchen, a smartphone, an internet connection, a Wegmans. Self-sufficiency. This is something the ancient sages explicitly valued, largely because it means one is less dependent on others and therefore both more free and less likely to sacrifice one's integrity through fawning and flattery. It's still valued in modern times. Robinson Crusoe, hero of one of the first great novels of modern times, is an exemplar of self-sufficiency. David Henry Thoreau's experiment of living in a little log cabin at Walden for 2 years was a sort of experiment in relative self-sufficiency. I think it's no accident that it was an American who undertook that experiment, since self-sufficiency is a virtue especially valued in North America. Admittedly, this observation is somewhat anecdotal. It's based on the fact that I know so many people here who are absurdly capable in a practical sense, at least compared to me. People who can put extensions on their houses, do their own plumbing, rebuild car engines, shoot and skin deer, and all the rest of it. By comparison, most of my British friends are pretty helpless. If they manage to successfully change a light bulb, they need to sit down and have a pot of tea afterwards, partly to celebrate, partly to recover. Some communities, like the Amish, place an especially high value on self-sufficiency, in the sense of trying to minimize dependence on modern technology. Interestingly, though, they exemplify communal rather than individual self-sufficiency. One reason they're able to manage so well, even farming without tractors and chainsaws, is that they rely on each other to provide the necessary additional labor power. Obviously, self-sufficiency is tied to living cheaply, since when you do something yourself, you aren't paying someone else to do it. Thus, frugality books are full of advice on how to brew your own beer, weave your own clothes, extract your own teeth, and so on. But overall, most of us are clearly less self-sufficient than our forebears. We depend on others to build and equip our houses, grow and distribute our food, make our clothes, provide our entertainment. We rely on a huge, complex infrastructure for energy, transportation, communication, and education, and we're lost without a battery of machines: cars, refrigerators, washers, dryers, microwaves, computers, cell phones, navigation devices, and so on. We've become ridiculously dependent on them, not just in a practical sense, but also psychologically. I hate to embarrass anyone or tell tales, but I feel the need to report that I once got a ride back from Rochester with Professor Gordon Atlas, and he kept his navigation device on the whole way. He said he found it comforting, even to Alfred Ullman. We should also note a complication here, though. Self-sufficiency may be part of the traditional notion of simple living, but in fairly obvious ways, using simplicity can make our lives using technology can make our lives much more simple. Ask yourselves, which is simpler, washing all your clothes and sheets by hand, or using a washing machine? Collecting and chopping wood to make a fire, or to cook over, or turning on a gas burner? Making a phone call, or walking across town to deliver a message? The point here is that the concept of simple living contains cross-currents. Reducing dependency on infrastructure and technology brings us closer to simple living in one way. We're more self-sufficient. But it takes us away from it in other ways. Basic tasks can take a huge amount of time. The simple and the natural have been connected in several ways. Cynic philosophers like Diogenes argued that whatever is natural cannot possibly be bad or shameful. So true to their words, some of them thought nothing of urinating, defecating, or even copulating in public. The Stoics stressed the importance of living in accord with nature in a different sense, more like going with the cosmic flow, orienting one's existence so that you aren't resisting the natural order of things, for example, the necessity of aging and dying. They also held, the Stoics did, that the study and contemplation of nature was one of life's greatest and most readily available pleasures. Our own notions of being close to nature are heavily influenced, of course, by Romanticism. The Romantic movement beginning in the 18th century was triggered by the advent of industrialization and increasing urbanization. And in response, writers like Rousseau, Wordsworth, Emerson, and Thoreau stressed the value of physical and spiritual closeness to nature. This, of course, is something that is easy to achieve in Allegheny County. For those poor souls condemned to live in cities, rookeries of pomp and vanity like Paris, London, or New York, union with nature comes less easily. But they try. The poor souls. The popularity of community gardens is one expression of this urge, and so too, for that matter, is country houses, the second residence to which one retreats in order to recover from the stress of the city with a few days of bucolic simplicity. Another sense of simple living is asceticism. Ascetics are people who deny themselves worldly comforts and physical pleasures. The word ascetic comes from the Greek term exesis, which means exercise or training, and was used to describe the practice of athletes getting ready for competition. Throughout history, there have been various sects and communities that have embraced the philosophy of self-denial. Many are religious: Buddhists, Jains, Calvinists, and Quakers, for instance, typically renounce a significant number of worldly pleasures. Monks and hermits have sometimes taken asceticism to an extreme, wearing no clothes, or perhaps wearing uncomfortable clothes such as hair shirts, attaching chains to the legs, sleeping on a hard floor without blankets, fasting for days, or eating only the simplest and most uninteresting food. Their purpose is usually to turn the mind away from the physical world and toward the spiritual realm. But asceticism can serve other purposes. It can be a means of penance, a path to enlightenment, or a method for cultivating virtues such as resilience and hardiness that are useful in this world. Asceticism, though, is thoroughly out of fashion today, obviously. True, we can perceive surviving traces of an ethic of self-denial in our everyday world when we describe some pleasure as sinful, or imply that certain pleasures, like those of sex or drink, should be spoken of only in guilty whispers. But advertisers spend vast amounts selling us comfort, luxury, and sensory indulgence, and the market for these appears robust. Not everyone in the frugal tradition advocates self-denial. This is Epicurus, one of my personal philosophical heroes. Epicureans identify pleasure as the primary good in life, although they typically stress that the best pleasures are usually the simplest and most easily obtained. Such things as plain but good food, friendship, the contemplation of nature, and engagement in satisfying work. This is another important sense in which people conceive of simple living. Epicurus expresses and embodies this aspect of simple living as well as anyone. He established a school in Athens called the Garden, so named because of the large garden he cultivated around the place where he lived with a group of friends and disciples. In opposition to Plato, Epicurus taught that pleasure is good, that it is in fact the beginning and end of the blessed life. And because of this, he's often been misrepresented as advocating a life of debauched sensual indulgence. Even back in his day, the Athenians loved to spread wild rumours about the kinky goings-on in Epicurus's garden. But contrary to popular opinion, Epicurus doesn't advocate unrestrained sensual indulgence. Epicurus's idea of a really, really, really good time is to sit in a garden and discuss philosophy with friends over wine and cheese. Although he was a prolific writer, we only have a few of his letters with some fragments. In one fragment of a letter that I particularly like, he says, "Send me some preserved cheese, that when I like, I may have a feast." Elsewhere, he writes, "Thanks be to blessed nature, because she has made what is necessary easy to supply, and what is difficult unnecessary." Interestingly, and I think correctly, he says that of all the things human beings need to be happy, the most important, by far, is friendship. So these are some of the senses of simple living. I won't go into the others I've mentioned there. You can ask questions about these if necessary. 2 points about these various senses are worth making before moving on. First, the concepts that we're talking about are obviously relative. Our notions of living on little is very different from that of someone in the 1930s or the 1830s, or people living today in rural China or the mountains of Bolivia. Secondly, the various notions overlap and intertwine. For instance, of the most common ways in which the impulse towards simple living expresses itself, one of the most common ways is gardening. And growing some of your own fruit and vegetables checks quite a few of the boxes. You save money. You're self-sufficient. You're in closer touch with nature. And you enjoy simple pleasures, like going out in the morning, hearing the birds singing, seeing the dew sparkle like diamonds on the fresh green grass, and sprinkling salt on the slugs so you can watch them shrivel up and die. Simple pleasures. Why live simply? So much for the various senses that attach to the notion of simple living. Let's turn to the main arguments philosophers have given to support their claim that the good life is the life of frugal simplicity. In my view, there are four main lines of argument: the religious, the moral, the prudential, and the aesthetic. These are often bound together, but they can be separated out. The most important by far are the moral and the prudential, but I'm only going to focus on moral reasons here, just for reasons of time. Moral arguments for simple living, then. First, simple living keeps one away from temptations towards vice. This is one of the oldest and simplest arguments for simple living. It's why Plato requires the rulers in his republic to forego private property and any sort of luxury, an idea that, in my view, is as sound today as it was in ancient Athens. It's one of the reasons why monasteries and convents required those entering them to take vows of poverty, humility, chastity, and obedience. And interestingly, it was an important consideration in the minds of those people in the 19th century America who decided to establish colleges in remote, rural locations. Let's face it, all of us who have been at Alfred for any length of time have known a dark hour, usually in late February, when we've asked, why here? Why did they put the university here? Well, part of the answer is that they wanted us to not be led into temptation. The town of North Yarmouth in Maine, for instance, sought to persuade the founders of Bowdoin College of its advantageous location by pointing out that it was, I quote, not so much exposed to many temptations to dissipation, extravagance, vanity, and various vices as great seaport towns frequently are. One assumes the lack of opportunities for dissipation mattered more to the fee-paying parents than to the students. But let us, who still enjoy our rural location, give thanks to the foresight of our founders. Imagine how it would be had Alfred University been located closer to some great cosmopolitan centre of decadence and temptation. We'd have sex going on in the dorms, binge drinking every weekend, fights outside GJ's, and hot dog day would degenerate after sunset into a lurid bacchanalian frenzy. Oh, where are we? Can we go back? Simple living builds good character. This too is an argument as familiar as it is old. How does simple living foster virtue? In various ways. Frugality encourages prudence, temperance, self-control. It keeps one out of debt and hence independence, so you never need to go begging or flattering. The same goes for self-sufficiency, which is also associated with a strong work ethic. The Romantics held that being close to nature is morally beneficial. All these arguments to suggest that frugality breeds virtue. But the most familiar argument is that doing without fancy foods, feather beds, and other such luxuries makes one a stronger person, better able to cope with adversity, more use in a crisis, more flexible, less likely to complain, and so on. Perhaps no society was ever more committed to the edifying benefits of simple living than ancient Sparta. The Spartan lifestyle could best be described as, well, Spartan. The main purpose of their famous austerity was to make them better soldiers by breeding qualities such as courage, hardiness, self-control, patriotism, and indifference to wealth. As part of the lifestyle designed to foster these virtues, at their daily communal meal, the Spartan men regularly ate a black broth made of pork, blood, salt, and vinegar. And I dug up the recipe for those of you who want to try it. By all accounts, it was pretty foul stuff. And it got some very negative reviews. One traveller who tried it commented, "Now I know why the Spartans don't fear death." But some of the older men supposedly got so used to it that they wouldn't eat anything else. The cult of simplicity spread into every aspect of Spartan life. For instance, they prized concise, pithy, direct speech, devoid of rhetorical flourishes, which is the origin of our word laconic. They even insisted that music be kept simple. One of their best harp players was once fined and had his instrument confiscated because he added an extra string to it. The reverse side of this argument, of course, is that wealth, luxury, and extravagance encourage undesirable qualities. Excessive concern for acquiring riches leads one to value possessions over people, and perhaps eventually to a life of crime or even to business school. Those who have more are more afraid of material loss, whereas if you ain't got nothing, you've got nothing to lose, as Epictetus said. Love of possessions and fear of their loss tends to make people selfish, less brave and less generous. Luxurious living makes one soft, slovenly, indolent, dependent on others, and prone to gout. These are the sort of arguments that are commonplace in the literature, from Plato to Thoreau. They have a prima facie plausibility, but we shouldn't accept them too uncritically. A lot depends on what sort of simple living one has in mind. Spartan austerity, monastic self-discipline, bucolic naturalness, and working-class frugality may carry positive associations, but other associations are also possible. Monasteries sometimes become hotbeds of religious narcissism and intrigue. Peasants may live close to nature, but they've also enjoyed a long-standing reputation for being ignorant, greedy, and cunning. Struggling against economic adversity may foster virtues such as resilience, self-sufficiency, and solidarity with one's community. But poverty can also be a breeding ground for crime, alcoholism, drug addiction, child abuse, delinquency, and depression. And a privileged upbringing, on the other hand, can sometimes instill moral integrity and an impressive sense of social obligation, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius being a case in point. These are the arguments for thinking that simple living leads to happiness. They dominate much of the discussion of frugality in the canonical literature. And they offer reasons for thinking that the people who live simply are more likely to be happy. Some of these we've touched on already. Some require very little commentary. And so I propose to move on to consider not these arguments, but the response to them on the part of the people. For 2,500 years, philosophers have been telling us that we shouldn't lust after wealth or seek happiness in possessions, that extravagance and luxury are spiritually corrupting, that the good life is the simple life. How persuasive have they been? The answer is not very. Opposed to the values of frugality and simplicity is a different cluster of desires, motivations, and values. These are the most prominent, I think. Acquisitiveness, possessiveness, extravagance, and luxury. And these values are pretty obviously alive and well in our culture. In a 2012 Gallup poll, 64% of Americans said that, like Travie McCoy, they wanted to be very rich. In 2010, US lottery ticket sales totaled $58 billion. You know the state with the highest sale? New York. A recent Gallup poll found that 57% of American adults had bought a lottery ticket during the previous 12 months. Clearly none of them had taken my tightwadery class. In my tightwadery class, students are required to chant in unison. Lottery tickets are for losers, they're a big fat waste of money. Right? Why do so many of us still yearn for riches? And why do those who acquire wealth, and sometimes those who don't, spend it so extravagantly? Well, there is of course one answer to the question, why lust after money, that at least some of the frugal sages should be sympathetic to. If you have lots of it, you rid yourself of certain anxieties. You can be fairly sure that you won't lack basic necessities, and that should bring a certain peace of mind. But that doesn't seem to be what most people who buy lottery tickets have in mind. After all, when do lottery tickets really take off in the sales? It's when the jackpot is some ridiculous figure like the $585 million jackpot in the recent Powerball lottery. Why do people get so excited over that sort of amount? Well, partly because, like Travie McCoy, they want to be like Oprah and the Queen. They have fantasies of extravagance. And extravagance is a fascinating topic. And here we're not talking about people living beyond their means. That's just fiscal imprudence. And Ben Franklin's already told us what to think about that. We're talking here about lavish expenditures by people who can afford them. The gossip rags are full of stories about celebrity extravagance, presumably because people enjoy reading them. For instance, did you know that Lisa Minnellis' wedding in 2002 cost an estimated $3.5 million? The marriage lasted 18 months. You know that pop star Bono attended a fundraiser in Italy and had an urge to wear a particular hat that he'd left behind in Ireland, so he had it flown out to him at a cost of $1,700. But according to the newspapers in 2011, the singer Rihanna spent $23,000 a week on her hair. Works out to over $1 million for the year. Obviously she missed the tightwadery class on haircutting. This is a nice house, but it's actually a dog house, a scaled-down version of Paris Hilton's mansion that she had built for her dog at a cost of $325,000. Do you know what sort of house you could get in Alfred for that sort of money? The former CEO of Tyco, Dennis Kozlowski, threw a party for his wife's 40th birthday on the island of Sardinia, where the guests were handed luxury togas. Jimmy Buffett was hired to provide the music, and the centerpiece was an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David that peed vodka. Kozlowski, you'll be pleased to hear, is currently serving the 7th year of his prison sentence for larceny. Notice the little frisson of pleasure rippling around the room on hearing that. Our glee is significant. Something in us, at least in some of us, automatically disapproves of this sort of excess and experiences satisfaction when we learn that the perpetrator has been punished by events. Why? What excites our disapproval? The rich will naturally say it's born of envy. There may be something in that. It's hard to disprove. Yet we don't disapprove of the rich spending their money on worthy causes, even though we might envy them their power to do so much good. The more obvious answer is that we disapprove of extravagance because it's so wasteful. The money could obviously be put to much better use. But before we leap lightly onto our moral high horse, we should consider two things. First, many people in the world would view some of our expenditures, which we consider perfectly reasonable, as fantastically extravagant. For instance, a family of 4 eating out at a good restaurant and then taking in a movie could easily drop $300. That's higher than the per capita annual income of some countries. This point's been made many times, of course. What counts as extravagance is relative. But there's another point that you don't see made so often. Let's consider some other examples of extravagance. How about this one? Or this one? Or this one? You see the problem. It's easy to wax lyrical about the virtues and the benefits of thrift, frugality, and the simple life. But who among us wishes that the super-rich celebrities of earlier ages had lived like Socrates or Diogenes? Who thinks it would be better if the Renaissance fat cats, the Medicis, the Gonzagas, or the Esquis had lived simply and frugally? And before you answer that question, remember we have a big art school here, including an art history department that provides honest work for half a dozen faculty. The same argument, of course, can be made about music, thanks to the extravagances of 18th century European aristocrats who employed entire orchestras and commissioned original works to enliven a dinner or a dance. Classical music thrived to produce the likes of Mozart and Beethoven. Think about what we do when we're tourists. Much of the time, we go to admire the fruits of some fat cat's extravagance. The pyramids, the terracotta warriors, castles, palaces, temples, and cathedrals, preferably vast and elaborate. Stately homes, imposing architecture, landscape gardens, frescoes, tapestries, ceramics, jewellery, statues, and paintings. Many produced at vast expense. It seems, in fact, that if everyone had taken the advice of Socrates and the gang of frugal sages, there would be no tourist trade. And not just because we'd all be too cheap to go anywhere. There'd be nothing to go and get your photo taken next to. If that's grammatical. But worse than all of this, think about it. Without upper-class extravagance, there would be no Downton Abbey. So here's a first reason to put a question mark against the frugal sage's recommendation that we all aim at the contentment and tranquility of the simple life. The fact is, much of what we think of as the notable achievements of civilization, from the Taj Mahal to the Cadillac, from the Hubble telescope to the modern Olympics, from the art and architecture of the Renaissance to the James Bond movies, is the result of individual or collective extravagance. Yet this is the stuff of culture. And we think the world is a lot more interesting because of it. Here's a second reason for questioning the wisdom of the sages. Take a look at this. Now, I challenge anyone to avoid thinking here in reprehensible stereotypes. We all know the grave on the left contains a man. How do we know? Well, from the epitaph, we can infer that the person was boring, pompous, and smug. Ergo, male. Case closed. And the person buried next to him is obviously his wife. Critical, frustrated, regretful, but for better or worse, attached. Probably through some mixture of loyalty and dependence. What's interesting for my purposes, though, is the suggestion from right field that the frugal life was stupid. Why would anyone think that? Why the note of regret? There's an obvious answer. The prosperous but frugal life wasn't very interesting. It was a life of opportunities forgone. These people failed to drink the milk from the coconut. If the wife could go round again, she'd do it all differently. She'd go trekking in the Andes, bungee jumping in New Zealand. She'd stand on the Great Wall of China. She'd play the tables at Monte Carlo, go scuba diving like the Atlases off the Florida Keys, get high and go skinny dipping in a thermal spring by moonlight. This attitude is Faustian. It's a kind of acquisitiveness. They're not for money or possessions, for experiences. The good life is one that is experientially rich. In ancient times, Wealth was valued mainly as a bulwark against adversity. As the Bible says, a rich man's wealth is a strong city, and like a high wall protecting him. But today, money is viewed more as a ticket to interesting and enjoyable experiences, exotic food, concert tickets, travel. In Goethe's drama, Faust sells his soul to the devil in return for the most experientially rich life imaginable. That's what he wants. And he boldly says to the devil that the devil can have his soul the moment that he, Faust, stops restlessly striving after new experiences and expresses contentment with what he has. In other words, the moment he achieves what the Frugal Sages call happiness. The Frugal Sages were not Faustian. They taught the pleasure of staying put, of tending one's garden, chatting with friends over a jug of wine and a bowl of cheese. They were decidedly not into novelty, adventure, or excitement. But why not? The answer, I think, is fairly simple. Until modern times, most people, A, had many more things than us to be afraid of, and B, enjoyed a much narrower range of recreational opportunities. Until fairly recently, your average peasant, artisan, merchant or scholar could count themselves lucky if they managed to escape famine, plague, war and brutal oppression, stay healthy and not suffer too much from the loss of loved ones. So if you attained mere contentment, you were doing pretty well. And besides, Disney World was not an option back in the day. To be sure, people recreated. There was music, dance, sport, theatre and sex. But the available range of pleasurable activities was so much narrower than we enjoy today. That's two problems with the philosophy of frugality. Here's a third. I have a fantasy. Suppose, just suppose, that the vodcast of this lecture, which you all now know how to access, suppose it goes viral this weekend. Suppose someone uploads it to YouTube and millions of people around the country, around the world in fact, watch it. However, because of its file size restrictions, YouTube can only take the first half of the lecture. So millions of people learn about the concept of simple living and the arguments in favour of it, and that's all they hear. And they're totally persuaded that frugal simplicity is the way to go. They tear up their credit cards, they cancel their subscriptions to this and that, and they pledge never to go near a shopping mall again. Millions do this. There is a tremendous outbreak of tightwaddery, a national epidemic of cheapskatery, right before Christmas. Question: would this be a good thing? I hate to admit this, but I'm afraid the answer is no. I hate to admit it because I do believe that most of us would be better off in the long run if we shifted somewhat in the direction of frugal simplicity. But we also have to acknowledge what economists call the paradox of thrift. If everyone starts being thrifty, consumer demand for goods and services will fall. Workers will be laid off. Unemployment will rise. Tax revenues will fall. Claims for unemployment benefit, Medicaid and food stamps, and so on, will rise. And the economy will quickly find itself deep in the toilet. So that's 3 question marks against all those philosophers advocating simple living. Why is the philosophy of frugality open to these objections? In my view, the reason is the same in every case. Bear in mind, it is a philosophy that is not concerned with abstract, timeless, theoretical problems, but with the question of how we ought to live. It was developed and elaborated almost entirely in a pre-modern world. In that world it made complete sense, but to state the obvious, the world has changed to an astonishing degree over the past 200 years. And here in the modernized world, our lives are more secure, experiential opportunities are greater, national economies are far more complex. So it should not be surprising if in some respects the ideas of the frugal sages seem outmoded. Does that mean that we should consign them to the dustbin of history, that we have nothing to learn from them? No, it doesn't mean that. A great deal of what they have to say about relishing the simple pleasures, about being close to nature, about valuing leisure over money and so on, is still important and true. Good advice based on insightful psychology. Furthermore, there's at least one other reason why the philosophy of simple living remains thoroughly relevant today. Ironically, this is also an aspect of modernity that most of the frugal sages did not consider or anticipate. But in this case, far from rendering their ideas out of date, it gives them a new timeliness and importance. Culture, adventure, excitement, and economic prosperity are fine things, but so is a habitable planet and an unspoiled natural environment. disgracefully, in the recent presidential election, neither of the main candidates was willing to discuss the problem of global warming or any other pressing environmental issue. As usual, in every speech, in every debate, it was the economy, stupid, and pretty much nothing else. Of course the economy matters, but as the cartoon of the gravestones reminds us, it is possible to be prosperous and stupid. Is the only way we can conceive of economic prosperity to imagine ourselves endlessly increasing the quantity of stuff we produce and consume. There are other models. For instance, models where the emphasis is not on maximizing the purchasing power of each individual, but on improving shared public amenities. Models where we focus less on GDP, the total market value of all we produce, and more on how the already abundant wealth of our society might be better distributed and used. The philosophy of simple living acquires a new relevance and importance both in our current economic crisis as we become more aware of the environmental crises confronting the planet. It can guide us and it can inspire us as individuals to reduce our ecological footprint, and it can help reorient our society's values to the things that matter most, the fundamental conditions for human happiness that really don't change that much over time. Our capacity to enjoy simple pleasures, an appreciation of beauty, and most of all, as Epicurus rightly observes, friendship. Thank you.